Greetings. Kennedy Hall here, contributor for Meaning a Catholic. I guess I'm at the satellite Canadian branch of the Meaning of Catholic Enterprises now, here in Stratford, Ontario. Speaking of Tim, and we've been talking about this Corona thing and all that, I don't want to suggest that I'm making any definitive statements on the objective seriousness of the various cases. Here's the thing. People are going to be affected by this. You know, people are affected by the flu. People are affected by colds. I'm not here to discredit what happens if a person is sick. People react to sicknesses differently. It's totally likely that we'll hear of somebody, probably an elderly person, but we'll hear of somebody who was affected by this. The regular cold still exists. The regular flu viruses still exist. The corona this version of the coronavirus is out there as well. It's one of the coronavirus is a spectrum of viruses. So obviously, like, there's going to be some people who get sick. That's the truth. I don't want to make a definitive statement, but I've spoken with a couple doctors, one of whom is very high ranking in a hospital and very common sense, very faithful Catholic man. And he basically said, listen, it is a cold virus that a lot of people aren't ready for because they've never had it. So it will probably affect the elderly and things like nursing homes. But he said it's important to remember that the complications with these types of viruses come by the way of what happens as a result of having one. So, for example, I've had pneumonia before. I had a cold and then I got pneumonia. I think the main problem is that, one of the main sources of fear is that people are assuming that the coronavirus that we're experiencing right now, in and of itself, is the same as the complications that it may bring. So if you really read the research, you know, CDC, Canada Health, whatever, all these sources, it speaks not about the coronavirus that we're experiencing right now as the thing that's potentially deadly. It's the fact that it's a cold virus that you're not used to, that you're not ready for if you've never had something like that. And if you're susceptible to things like pneumonia, there's a higher chance you'll get it, and pneumonia itself has a higher chance of fatality, obviously, than other things. So that's important to keep in mind. But besides all the scientific stuff out there, the one thing that's been concerning me the most with the general hoopla around this coronavirus is that, you know, I expect your average sort of secular person, you know, watching CNN all the time, you know, doesn't have a faith life. I expect people like that to sort of just eat up everything that they're told by the media, because that's just kind of how it goes. You know, watching cable television, listening to the top 40 music. I expect people that sort of live in that world, when something like this happens, to go out and like hip check people to get toilet paper. It's nuts. But I've noticed something that I find unfortunate, and I hope this will be hard for some people to hear, but, you know, let's use an analogy. In an election season, I would imagine most people watching this are at least sympathetic to Donald Trump. I myself am Canadian. I've never voted for him. If I was American, I would vote for Donald Trump, I would imagine. For the pro-life reasons, etc., just the reasons people tend to say. But in an election cycle, I would never trust most of the mainstream media for virtually anything. Because I know that virtually everything that comes out of even a lot of conservative sources is just a lie. That's just how it goes. Or it is a spin on the truth, etc. And it's not objective. It's opinion. It's got bias. That's just how it goes. And most Catholics, especially conservative, traditionally minded Catholics, they understand that. So they're going to say, oh, CNN, I won't listen to them. Oh, Washington Post, I won't listen to them, etc. But then as soon as this virus becomes a big thing in the news, all of a sudden, I see so many folks that would never touch these media sources with a 10-foot pole, all of a sudden believing the hype coming from these same sources. Now, I'm not even saying that those sources are necessarily wrong. But if you knew somebody, another example, if you knew someone that you worked with that always lied to you, why would you trust them when things got tough? Even a family member. You know, if you had a brother who was always telling you something that wasn't true, why would you trust him all of a sudden when your well-being is at stake? I'm not saying that all the major, what do they call them, alphabet organizations, CNN, ABC, I'm not saying that they're all wrong. I'm not saying that. I mean, it's possible that somebody on the show just reads some information from the CDC and the numbers are fine. I don't know. But it seems strange that we would think, as traditional Catholics, as conservative Catholics, that we would actually think that organizations that devote millions of dollars to supporting, promoting, and advocating for politicians, personalities, etc., who advocate for the destruction of unborn children, euthanasia, terrible science on human sexuality, etc. Why would we ever trust them for anything that has to do with our well-being? You know, here in Canada, I can't pay my taxes without some money indirectly going to abortion. Why am I going to trust my Prime Minister, whoever, telling me about the well-being of Canadians when he has said that abortion is a human right up to the moment a child's born? People who think that way are not sane. If someone is a pro-abortion supporter, they don't have a realistic concept of human life. Why would we trust these sources for information about human life, about our well-being? How is it that we can, especially as conservative, traditional-minded Catholics, you know, one minute, like I said, we can't stand Washington Post as far as we can throw it, but then as soon as there's a virus, it's like, oh, they must be telling us the truth. Now, I'm not saying everybody's doing that, but I have seen a lot of that. And what's interesting is, some of the best information and research I've seen is where independent folks like Chris Ferrara has an incredible article at The Remnant on this. He went and he looked at the CDC numbers, just went to the sources of the sources and did his own mathematics. And the numbers of, basically the scare is way less when you do your own research. You know, and even conservative sources, Wall Street Journal, whatever. I mean, a lot of those are doing a little bit better and they're a little bit more reasonable. But you have to understand, they're still part of the whole thing. Like, they're still part of the whole conglomerate. They might give Christians more of a voice, and they'll have pro-life editorials and all this. That's great. But they're not faithful Catholics. They're not living in a state of grace for the most part. Their intellects are in a dead soul. That's the case for most people. So I'm not, once again, I'm not making a statement on who's going to get it, who's going to not, what it's going to do. Objectively, the numbers are extremely low, even in places with bad healthcare systems compared to the average flu season or cold season. I know some people don't want to hear that, but that's the reality. You can make your own decision from that. Stay home if you want, do whatever you got to do, be prudent, I guess. But Catholics, this is not a plague like anything we've ever seen. People are not dropping dead in the street. They're not coming by saying, bring out your dead, and we give our loved ones out to the horse carts that drive by to take them to the mass graves. People aren't dying in the street. What are we doing if we're living in fear? God knows the numbers of our days. No virus, no antibiotic, no nothing. It's bad grammar. Nothing will get in the way of God's will being done. He might permit something to happen to us. He might will something to happen to us in the you know, not the opposite of permissive will, active will. He might. You can't know that. This is an airborne, cold virus. It's in the air. You can sit in your home if you want, and you can stay away from people. Okay, that's your choice. But this is not a plague. And we're acting as if it's not a big deal. And a lot of people are saying, well, it's okay, they've closed masses. It's alarming that so many Catholics are passive about the idea that churches are closed. The only place on earth that matters in a time of struggle is the church. The churches did not close during the bubonic plague. They did not close unless they were exploded during World War II, or unless there was a state intervention. That's the thing. There haven't been any state interventions where I live saying you have to close your churches. There's just been interventions saying you got to keep, gatherings lower than 200 or whatever. So guess what? You offer more masses if you're a church. Our chapel, the Society of St. Pius X, is staying open. They have to have masses less than 50 or 60 people, whatever the number is. You know what they're going to do? They're going to send out an email, however they're going to do it, and we're going to register. And they're going to offer more masses. Because that's so we can go. Usually there's about 150 people there. They're going to have to offer 3 instead of 1. That's the appropriate response. We should be outraged at the fact that we're spending less time in church when there is more evil in the world. The fact that the average diocese has stopped all their masses. I was speaking to someone and they were saying, well, I basically said to the person, how can we trust that these dioceses, whatever, actually care about our souls when in the time of crisis, even though it's nothing like the bubonic plague, but for us it's a great crisis, in this time, they're closing the doors to the sacraments. Think about that. Our world has gone nuts. Occasions for sin are everywhere. And I'm not talking about just pornography, etc. But if you're trying to get toilet paper, you might get in a fight at the grocery store. How crazy is that? The temptations that we are going to face in times like this, that will pull us away from the virtuous path, are greater than they have been for a long time. And at this time, the help for the journey, which is the Eucharist, the graces of hearing Mass, the graces of going to confession, etc., they're taking those supernatural aids away from our lives as we have to face greater spiritual and moral temptation. This is a time where everybody is susceptible to despair, yet they're taking away the medication for that in a spiritual sense, which is the Eucharist. Doesn't make any sense. So, I don't know what this is going to be. Conspiracy theories are, well, they abound right now, and maybe some of them are true, and this does seem kind of strange. But I'll finish one last story. My nonno Giuseppe Vianney, God rest his soul, he grew up during World War II. He was a young teenager when it happened, and he lived in Italy, as the name suggests. And there were times when he had to eat, basically for 4 or 5 months at a time, he had to eat river eel and stale bread, and they'd hide their flour in the rafters, and villages had fighting in them, etc., and the Nazis and the Americans, everyone's going through, and it's a whole mess, and living under Mussolini and the whole 9 yards. And they still went to Sunday Mass. His grandparents lived through his parents lived through the Spanish flu, where millions and millions and millions died. This will be thousands, maybe tens of thousands worldwide. Millions and millions, tens of millions died during the Spanish flu. They still went to Mass. They increased the Masses. Yet in 2020, when we live in relative peace, and we have the greatest medical interventions known on the face of the earth in the history of mankind, our diocese, for the most part, are suspending people's access to the Holy Eucharist because they don't believe that the Eucharist brings life. They're actually worried about it bringing death. Please pray for our priests and pray for the bishops who have made this decision. God bless.